Today's lesson is fun facts about the beautiful game. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we're going to continue talking about World Cup 2022, or we're going to talk about football, soccer, which is referred to as the beautiful game for various reasons. But probably the biggest reason why people go nuts about soccer is it's the most popular sport in the world. Outside of North America, of course. And, of course, the biggest event in soccer is the World Cup, which is going on right now.
Right. And we also looked at the name soccer, how this game got the name soccer, that it came from the word association. And we also talked a bit about this year's World Cup in Qatar, and it's going to happen in November because of the weather.
Indeed. So, yeah, it gets so hot there in the Middle East that they decided to have the tournament later on in the year. And it's been going on for the last month or so. And the final is coming up in just a couple of days. So, yeah, get excited about that. Hopefully, we've got some interesting facts to continue sharing with you. So let's get to it, everybody. Let's talk about the first World Cup competition that took place way back in 1930.
The first World Cup took place in 1930 in Uruguay. Uruguay was selected to host the first cup because it had successfully defended its football title at the 1928 Olympics. With only 13 teams competing compared to 32 in 2022, that first tournament was a relatively small affair, but it set the stage for the massive global event the Cup has since become.
So here's an interesting piece of information. The first World Cup took place in 1930 in Uruguay. So Uruguay was selected to host the first cup because it had successfully defended its football title at the 1928 Olympics. So in 1930, Uruguay hosted the first World Cup because 2 years ago it had won the football tournament in the Olympics. So they were selected to be the host of the first ever World Cup.
And, of course, Uruguay is a country in South America. It's right next to Brazil. I should mention that a lot of Westerners pronounce this word as Uruguay, but in Espanol, I guess it would be pronounced Uruguay. So Uruguay, or Uruguay, held the first World Cup competition way back in 1930, and Uruguay was selected to host the first cup because it had successfully defended its football title at the 1928 Olympics. So they played soccer at the Olympics back in 1928, and Uruguay defended its title. So if you defend in this particular case, that means you win the competition again after having won it the last time. So for example, if the Dallas Cowboys won the Super Bowl in 2021, and then they won it again in 2022, then we say they defended their title. Of course, they didn't. Nowadays, the Dallas Cowboys are a terrible team, but I was just using that as an example.
Right. With only 13 teams competing compared to 32 in 2022, that first tournament was a relatively small affair. But it set the stage for the massive global event the Cup has since become. So in the first ever World Cup tournament, there were only 13 teams competing. And when you compare that to 2022, a year in which 32 teams are competing, then that first tournament is relatively small, comparatively small. However, it did something very important.
Exactly. We could say that that first competition set the stage for the massive global event the Cup has since become. Now, if you're going to put on some kind of performance, you need to prepare. You need to set the stage. You need to prepare the stage for your performance. But nowadays, the phrase to set the stage for something means you start something and then it later becomes quite big and quite popular. So, yes, indeed, the World Cup was held in Uruguay in 1930. And back then it was the first one, so people thought, well, you know, it's kind of fun, it's interesting, but it's not really that spectacular. But later on, when it finished, people realized that, that wasn't so bad after all. So maybe we could have another competition like that in 4 years' time or something like that. And gradually, over the years, the competition grew bigger and bigger. So indeed, the Uruguay Games in 1930 set up the preparations, made the preparations or set the stage for the massive global event that the World Cup has since become. If something's massive, it's really, really big. And of course, people all over the world are going to be watching the World Cup.
Right. So for the phrase set the stage for, I can also say the company, Apple, set the stage for the popularity of smartphones with their first iPhone back in 2007. And as for the word massive, which Roger mentioned means very large or something that's very heavy, you can say that a massive gathering of people could be seen at the concert. Or you could also say that the elephant was massive, meaning the elephant was huge and it weighed a lot.
Or the politician died of a massive heart attack. That does happen sometimes. But in this particular case, we're talking about the massive global event, which is the World Cup. That, again, as we said, is going on right now as we speak. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now and talk about the roots of football.
Football has ancient and somewhat rowdy roots. Modern football was born in England in the 19th century, having developed from the many ball games played by students at some of the nation's elite schools. However, comparable games had been popular in Britain since at least the Middle Ages and were often played in villages during religious festivals. These folk games were often incredibly violent and sometimes involved the entire local population attempting to get a blown-up pig's bladder to one end of the village or the other, sometimes by any means necessary. Fortunately, for today's players, the modern game is far more civilized.
大家好，第二部分我们看到形容词 rowdy， 它的意思是粗暴的或是吵闹的。举例来说 ，The pub often has a rowdy atmosphere late at night。这个酒吧到了深夜常常有喧闹的气氛。又或者说 ，It's already midnight. Please don't be too rowdy. 现在已经午夜了，请不要太吵闹。再来，我们看到单字 elite， 这个字是形容词，意思是精英的或是最优秀的。例如 The government sent an elite unit of soldiers to capture the leader of a terrorist group. 该政府派出一支精锐军队去追捕恐怖集团的首领。或是 Alexandria went to an elite private school in the suburbs. Alexandria 于郊区的一所精英私校就读。接着我们看到单字 comparable， 它是形容词，指的是相当的、类似的或是可相比的。例如Jenny could not think of a comparable experience that was more fun than river rafting. Jenny 想不到比泛舟更有趣的经历了。或者我们可以说 The intelligence of a parrot is comparable to that of a 3-year-old child. 鹦鹉的智力可比一个3岁小孩。另外这个字的字尾去掉 able 加上 e 就变成动词 compare， 意思是比较或是对照。举例来说Emily compared the functions of the two cameras to decide which one to buy. Emily 比较两款相机的功能来决定要买哪一款。又或者是 There's no need to compare yourself to others. 你没有必要拿自己跟其他人比较。接下来我们看到副词 incredibly， 它的意思是极其或是难以置信的。我们可以说 What you did was incredibly brave. 你所做的事极其勇敢。也可以说Elaine is an incredibly smart woman who can speak 5 languages. Elaine 是一个极为聪明的女人，她会说5种语言。
So now let's look at the roots of football. Football has ancient and somewhat rowdy roots. Now, the word rowdy here means noisy, causing trouble. We can use the word to describe a crowd. Sometimes crowds outside bars and restaurants get rowdy, which means they start laughing really loudly and maybe a fight starts and they're talking at the top of their voices and neighbors start complaining. So that is rowdy behavior. And it says here, football has very old beginnings. It started a long time ago, and it also has rowdy roots.
Indeed, so it does have exciting beginnings. Modern football was born in England in the 19th century, which would be the 1800s, having developed from the many ball games played by students at some of the nation's elite schools. So, yes, indeed, during the 1800s, people in England were playing sports, and they had all sorts of different kinds of ball games depending on where you were, and then eventually they exchanged information with each other, and they started to standardize some of these sports, and eventually we have football that we all know and love today. But we're talking about some of the elite schools in England. Okay, there could be Oxford or Cambridge, etc., or Eton. Those are famous schools that are elite. They're difficult to get into. You need to have a lot of smarts, a lot of intelligence, and you probably need some connections to get into those schools. Of course, in the U.S., we have elite schools like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, etc. Here in Taiwan, of course, you've got elite schools as well. Elite just means they're the top universities.
That's right. However, comparable games had been popular in Britain since at least the Middle Ages and were often played in villages during religious festivals. So even though football was born in England in the 19th century, there were certain games that were comparable to modern football, which means that they are fairly similar, so they can be compared to each other. And these games were popular or had been popular since the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages would cover a time period, generally speaking, from around 500 to 1200 or 1300.
Indeed. And I guess back during the Middle Ages, they played games that were similar to soccer, right?
Right. So these two games are comparable, and I can also use this word in another context. For instance, I could say that the iPhone is expensive, but you can find comparable smartphones for a lot cheaper.
You certainly can, so do some shopping to get a good bargain on a smartphone. But yes, these were similar games or maybe had similar rules. Of course, we're talking about the Middle Ages in England, so there wasn't television, there weren't phones. So these villages basically had their own versions of these games, and it was difficult to know what other villages were doing. And of course, these games were popular in Britain, and they were played in villages during religious festivals. Now, these folk games were often incredibly violent and sometimes involved the entire local population attempting to get a blown-up pig's bladder to one end of the village or the other, sometimes by any means necessary. That sounds like a pretty weird game to be playing there, but we're describing these games as being folk games. Folk here, F-O-L-K, the L is silent there, refers to people or just common people. You may have heard of, say, folk music, which is music that is played by regular people like farmers and peasants.
Right, so these were folk games because they were not official games. They were games played by people in villages, by farmers, only locally known. So if you were not from that place, you probably wouldn't know about those games, and that's why they're called folk games. And they were often incredibly violent. Here, the word incredibly just means extremely or very. Something that is incredible cannot be believed, but used in this way, it doesn't mean that something can't be believed. Literally, it just means that it's very extremely violent.
Right, incredibly violent, very, very violent. I could say that as a result of my actions, I felt incredibly ashamed and I had to apologize to everybody for what I did. But at this time, back in the Middle Ages, these games were very, very violent. You could describe American football as being kind of violent, where they bash into each other and try to tackle each other and stuff like that. But during the Middle Ages, there may have been some serious injuries and maybe even people dying. So these games were very, very violent. They were incredibly violent. And the entire local population, everybody living in the village, were trying to or attempting to get a blown up pig's bladder to one end of the village or the other. Now, this would be from a pig here, the bladder of a pig. That is an organ in the pig's body. They cut it out of the pig and they blew it up with air to make it into a kind of ball.
Right. So more specifically, the bladder is that organ that's like a bag in your body that collects your pee. So when you have to go to the bathroom, you have to pee, it means that your bladder is full. So I suppose back then it was difficult for them to get rubber balls, and the only way to make a ball was to use a pig's bladder, fill it up with air, and then you have a ball that you can play with.
Right, so they're trying to move this ball, this bladder, to one end of the village or the other. A lot of times by any means necessary, which means in any way that you possibly could. So, of course, they had to use lots of ways to move that ball, which could involve violence. Fortunately for today's players, the modern game is far more civilized. So yes, indeed, it's not so violent nowadays. Oh, yes, you do have people trying to kick the ball and they tackle another player and send them to the ground, and that player decides to fake an injury and he tries to get a free kick or something like that. But for the most part, modern football is not at all violent. Sometimes people do get injured, of course, and actually sometimes I think they actually die in the field, but that is rare. And fortunately for people today, it's more civilized, which means they're just not so savage. They're not trying to beat each other and kill each other.
Right, and that's a fortunate thing. So we can say fortunately to describe this situation. It's used to emphasize that something good has happened, that something has improved, or something has improved with a bit of luck, which is what fortune means. So fortunately for players of football today, they have less chances or fewer chances of getting hurt because the game has become more civilized. So civilized means polite, reasonable, perhaps lacking in violence. So I could say, let's not fight about this. Let's talk about this in a civilized manner.
Indeed, we want to be civilized. We don't want to be savages. We don't want to be immature like children or like animals. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson. Let's wrap things up now with the third and final part.
In short, football has a long and fascinating history. So keep these facts in mind as you watch more history get made at this year's big event.
最后第三部分我们看到形容词 fascinating 指的是极为有趣的或是迷人的。举例来说 Justine read a fascinating article on indigenous tribes in the Amazon. Justine 读到一篇引人入胜的文章，内容关于亚马逊原住民部落。又或者说 The film festival included a number of fascinating documentaries. 那个影展包含好几部非常好看的纪录片。
So to conclude today's discussion about football or soccer, we can say that in short, football has a long and fascinating history. So the history of football is long because it's been around for a long time. It's also fascinating because it's very interesting. It has a lot of aspects that may raise the curiosity of people who don't know much about it. So in that sense, football has a long and fascinating history.
It is fascinating. It has a lot of information that is very interesting to learn about. So keep these facts in mind. as you watch more history get made at this year's big event. So if you keep something in mind, that means you just remember that thing for future reference. So, in school, you want to keep the school rules in mind. Keep them in mind so that you don't get in trouble later on if you accidentally break one of those rules. And by all means, enjoy this year's tournament. The final is coming up in just a couple of days. Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Let's turn things over now to Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第二部分有一个句子写到，这些民间运动通常都非常暴力。那么文中是用副词 incredibly 来表达极其怎么样，非常怎么样。那它的形容词是 incredible。 我们来补充它的字根。 CRED 这个字根是指信任、相信，像 credit 这个名词就有信誉、信用的意思，所以应该不难看出 CRED 这个字根可以表达信任、相信嘛。好，我们的字尾 IBLE 就跟 ABLE 一样，可以表达可怎么样的，能怎么样的，所以把这两部分合在一起 credible 就是可靠的、可信的或是真实的。那我们接着在 credible 前面加上否定字首 in incredible， 那就是难以置信的、不可思议的。它其实也可以用来表达极好的、很棒的。好，我们顺便补充一组有相同字根的单字 credulous 和 incredulous。 我们刚刚说 CRED 有信任、相信的意思嘛，那在后面加上 ULOUS， 这是形容词字尾，表示倾向于什么、习惯于什么。那如果你总是习惯相信别人、倾向于相信别人，可能就比较容易被骗咯。 Credulous 就表达说轻易相信的、容易受骗的。那在 credulous 前面加上否定字首 in 变成 incredulous， 那就表示不轻信的、怀疑的或是疑心重的。好，课文接着写到说，有时当地所有居民都试图将一个充气的猪膀胱带到村庄的一端或是另一端，有时会借由任何必要的手段。那文中它是用到 by any means necessary， 意思是不计一切、不择手段或是无论如何。其中的名词 means 在这边是指手段、方法，它固定要用复数形。那我们也来补充几个跟 means 有关的用语。第一个是 by means of， 它是指借由、利用或是以什么样的方式，那可以表达透过某事物来作为途径啊、手段去达成某个目的。by means of 后面可以接名词或动名词。第二个补充的用语是 by all means， 这个用语呢，常常用来允许别人做某事或是答应某人的请求，它就带有那种 of course、certainly 的语义。像对方问说 May I come in？ 我可以进来吗？就可以回答说 by all means，表示当然可以咯。第三个补充的是 by no means， 它是带有否定意味的副词片语，表示 not at all 或者是 in no way， 也就是绝不、一点也不。特别注意，如果我们把 by no means 摆在句首来做强调的话，后面就必须进行倒装，所以会写作 by no means加上 be 动词加主词，或者是 by no means 加上助动词加主词。举例来说， By no means did I mean to hurt your feelings。 我绝不是有意要伤害你的感情的。好，那么以上今天重点整理，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Defend. France aims to defend its 2018 World Cup title at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Massive. A massive crowd waited outside the gates of the stadium before the big game. Comparable. The two computers were of comparable quality, so Brenda bought the cheaper one. Incredibly. Colin felt incredibly sleepy after staying up all night to study for the test. Fortunately. Fortunately, no one was hurt in the accident. Fascinating. As a fan, Tony found the show about the history of rock music fascinating.
Discussion Starter starts now!
And here's our discussion starter for today. What fun fact about football were you most surprised or interested to learn about? Why?
Well, I was surprised to learn that the word soccer came from association because I would think that soccer would be called social if it came from association.
Good thinking there, but I was surprised to learn that the first World Cup took place in Uruguay because I thought soccer came from England. You would think that the first World Cup would take place there, but it actually took place all the way around the other world in a small South American country. Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoyed reading along with us. I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.